Is it possible for a child of 4 to have a conversion? This is what happened to Anne de Gagny. She was a natural-born leader, but this natural power was almost too difficult for such a young child to control, and so she struggled with tantrums when she didn't get her way. Even children older than her were intimidated by her temper, as one of the older cousins can attest when she forced him to climb a towering sand pile by pulling and yanking on his arm. No one ever said no to Anne, and if they did, they learned not to. But all this changed the day Anne said yes to Jesus. Anne was born on April 25, 1911, in Annecy, France. Her parents were very wealthy and owned 2 chateaux, one overlooking Lake Annecy, where she lived most of her life, and one in Cannes, where they stayed for a few months during the winter. Anne had 3 other siblings, Jacques, whom Anne called Jojo, Lelaine, and Marionette. Despite their wealth, Anne's parents were not worldly or vain. Both parents were very devout in their faith and gave money and food to the poor regularly. Anne was always the leader in games. Whatever game was played, it was usually a game she chose, and if not, then she somehow was the one who called the rules. Anne was not a bad little girl, she just had a personality that was too big for her 3-year-old body. One time, when visiting the zoo with some older cousins, Anne's aunt overheard her say to one of her cousins, who was considerably bigger than she was, "Come along, I will hoist you up so you can pet the giraffe." Anne was very affectionate and loved having her parents all to herself, so when her little brother Jojo arrived, she wasn't very happy. She had to be watched closely as her dislike for her little brother was very evident. One time, she was so jealous to see her mother holding the baby that she ran up with sand and tried to rub it in his eyes. However, as Jojo grew, Anne learned to love him, and when her 2 little sisters, Lelaine and Marionette, came along, Anne discovered that she enjoyed being the oldest because it meant she could be in charge of everyone. And so you can see that little Anne had quite a strong personality with a very strong will. Had she never said yes to Jesus, it's difficult to say what kind of life she would have led when she was so used to getting her own way. Her father was a lieutenant in the army, and 3 times he came home injured. The first 2 times, he wasn't injured too badly and could recover at home. Anne enjoyed playing nurse and tending to her father, walking around with his crutches. But when he was injured a 3rd time, his wounds were bad enough to be in the hospital. Anne's mother took her with her to visit her father in the hospital, and it was the first time Anne began to see a world larger than her own. She saw rows and rows of beds filled with wounded men. Her mother whispered to her that these men were suffering for France. Although Anne was only 4 years old, she wasn't able to completely understand what her mother meant, but she did understand what it felt to hurt, and her heart was stirred with compassion. Her father recovered enough that he felt he must get back to his men, even though his wounds were still open. After receiving absolution from the priest, he led his men to the attack and fell for the last time. 4 days later, on July 28th, Anne's mother received the news of her husband's death. Biographers say that upon her father's death, it seemed that all his virtues had fallen into Anne as an inheritance, for it was that day when Anne began to change. Anne knew her mother was very sad, and she wanted to make her happy. She was a very practical little girl, and in her mind, the best way to make her mother happy was by being obedient. She tried hard all day long to do little things to make her mother happy and to keep the younger kids quiet. "You must be quiet, Jojo, because Mother is sad," she would say to her noisy little brother. Changing herself meant saying no to herself and yes to others, and this meant hard work. Anne no longer sought to get her own way, but instead went out of her way to do things for others. She settled little disputes among her siblings and entertained them with games of their choice to keep things quiet for her mother. The new governess who came along 4 months later was more than a little surprised when she was told that at one time, Anne had been very difficult to deal with. She writes, I first took charge of Anne when she was 4.5 years of age, and I was really charmed by the easy grace of her manner as she came to greet me. One could not help loving her. Although so tiny, there was something about her even then that inspired respect. She was very sensible too, and she had such a kind little heart. When we returned to the chateau at Annecy, she was very anxious about me for fear that I should fret over leaving my parents, who lived near Cannes. Almost as soon as we arrived, she took me around the garden and wanted me to pick some flowers. "You must do just as if this was your own home," she said. "Pick all the flowers you like and send them to your mother to comfort her." The next morning, I heard a soft little knock at my door. It was the dear child coming to see if I had slept well. All day long, she was trying to help me. Demoiselle is what Anne nicknamed the governess, because she explained, "Mademoiselle sounds so stiff, and we want to make her feel at home." Anne fully realized what any allusion to the war meant to me, wrote her mother. If we saw an officer home from the front or anyone spoke of the war, she would come up to me and whisper in my ear, "Remember, Daddy is happy, he is in heaven." Her loving little heart was always on the watch. Even in the middle of a game, she would stop playing if she heard a word about the war and run up to me with a word of comfort. Anne was naturally protective of her mother, but her generosity of spirit extended to strangers as well, as we see in this next story. One time, a man had come to see her mother about business matters, but her mother wasn't home at the time. After seeing the man waiting alone in the foyer, Anne came down to entertain him until her mother arrived. "Entertaining guests is tiresome, isn't it?" she said later to her mother. "But I thought he might find it dull to wait alone, so I decided to entertain him." By the man's laughter, he had been very entertained. At 5 years old, Anne started pestering her mother to receive her first Holy Communion. Although she was much younger than the other students, Madame de Guény allowed Anne to join the catechism class that was taught by Mother St. Raymond. Although she was the littlest, Anne was far ahead of all the other kids in the class. Mother St. Raymond writes, "I soon saw that Anne was a very gifted child. Her manner was so sweet too. She always seemed to know how to adapt herself to other people's tastes, and she was as nice with some rather spoiled children as with those who behaved well. I do not think I ever saw her in a bad humor or upset over anything." There was still the occasional struggle for Anne to give up her strong will, especially in the beginning. Once, when a game wasn't going the way she liked, she left the game momentarily to try to gain control of herself. Running up to Demoiselle the governess, she blurted out to her, "Oh, how I do want to be cross." And then she would tighten her lips with resolve and run back to the game as though they were playing it exactly how she wanted. When the year of catechism classes came to an end, everyone felt very confident that Anne was more than ready to receive her first communion. All but the bishop, that is, who was perturbed to see a child of 5 on his list of first communicants. He insisted on grilling Anne with a rigorous examination. Not only did Anne answer all the questions correctly, but out of fascination, he continued to question her on other things. Satisfied, he brought Anne back to her mother and Mother St. Raymond, who were waiting anxiously outside, and said, "I wish you and I were as well prepared to receive our Lord as this little girl is." Anne received her first communion, and it was a joyful day for her. Throughout the day as she was playing, she would spontaneously fold her hands and say, "Oh, thank you, Jesus," as though it hit her all over again that she got to receive communion. She was so grateful and in awe of receiving our Lord that she naturally assumed that this was the case for everyone. When her little brother would misbehave and nothing else inspired him to be good, she would say, "Jojo, remember, you need to be good because you're going to receive Jesus tomorrow." Now we must talk about Anne's sacrifices. They were not big sacrifices, and her mortifications were not chains or hair shirts, for she was only 7 years old. Anne's sacrifices were controlling her own emotions and making sure not to hurt feelings, putting others before her in games or serving desserts, and sometimes giving up sweets. Mostly her little brother Jojo gave her the most opportunity to offer up sacrifices. One day when Anne lost her first tooth, it caused a lot of excitement among the children in the household because they were told that when someone lost their first tooth, they would receive a present. Sure enough, a big parcel arrived at the doorstep, and all the children crowded around as Anne opened her gift. There were a lot of oohs and ahs as Anne pulled out a small porcelain doll's washstand that ran real water. Anne was beside herself with joy, and all 4 children were soon playing with it happily. Unfortunately, disaster soon struck as Jojo, who was not as careful, somehow knocked the washstand over and it was in pieces all over the floor. Anne's first impulse was to cry and scold, but one look at Jojo's tearful face and Anne was soon comforting her brother, telling him that it was okay. Feeling better and already forgetting about the incident, Jojo and the others ran off to play with something else, leaving Anne with her broken toy. She looked up at the governess with tears running down her face and said with a smile, "It's all right, for now I have made Abraham's sacrifice." It was her treasure that she gave up for God, and so it was her sacrifice. She also mortified herself by not complaining when sick or when she had to have unpleasant medical remedies, such as mustard poultices which were smelly and sometimes caused burns. As a mustard poultice was removed, she would sometimes gasp in pain, but immediately would say, "Jesus, I offer this to you." At this time, this was shortly after her father's death, so she was only 5 years old. Another time, she had paratyphoid, which required a bland diet as part of the healing process. She, who used to sneak sweets, didn't complain as she ate the same tasteless meals, while the others had nicer things on their plates. Mother St. Raymond writes, "Anne really was mortified in all her senses. She had an absolute horror of anything that wasn't pure. I had told all the children to be careful not to look at anything unpleasant in the streets or elsewhere, and I am sure she obeyed me most strictly, for she seemed to have great control over her eyes. Even in catechism class, she looked only at me and did not give way to that curiosity which is so natural to children. One time, when I brought something to show them, Anne never rushed forward to see what it was. She would wait until the others had seen as much as they wanted or until I called her to come and look." In church as well, Anne gave great care to keep her eyes and focus only on the priest. One lady without faith came into the church and saw Anne praying and was immediately struck by what she saw. "Never again," she declared afterwards, "no, never again will I say there is no God." For the 11 short years Anne was on the earth, her simple life held many stories of acts of charity, and I wish I could tell all of them, but as this would make the video too long, let me tell you of a few of my personal favorites. One time, one of the cooks in the house, who was an elderly lady named Jean, was in the yard plucking fowls. It wasn't going well, as there were fleas on the chicken feathers and had begun to hop all over Jean. Anne saw what was happening and jumped in to help. "You mustn't be the only one to suffer, Jean," she said. "I'll have half." And she spent a long time trying to catch the fleas before they hopped, so the old woman could continue plucking feathers. Another time, Anne had heard about a poor woman in a nearby village who lost their home to a fire, leaving herself and her 4 small children homeless. Anne was very distressed at hearing this, but being a young girl, there wasn't much she could do. Then she came up with a bright idea. She would set up a bazaar to raise money for the family. And so she did. She and her siblings made little crafts and saved their desserts to sell. They made up stalls of refreshments, bouquets of flowers, dishes of fresh fruits, and homemade toys that they sold for high prices. Soon they collected a sum that was enough to help the woman with at least some of her needs, and the bazaar awakened the consciences of the community too. And now another example of Anne's great love for her somewhat naughty brother Jojo, who loved Anne as well, but wasn't quite as good at showing it. He had been teasing her by throwing one of her dolls high up in the air and catching it, while Anne was imploring him to stop and give it back. This doll had a glass head, and as he tossed it high in the air, what Anne feared would happen happened. It shattered all over the floor. This would have been one time when it would have been fine for Anne to be upset with her brother, as it was justifiable. But Jojo was sorry, and of course, Anne forgave him. Anne was so worried about her brother getting into trouble that she stayed awake late in the night until her mother came home. When her mother checked in on her, Anne sat up and said, "Oh, Mother, I didn't want to go to sleep until I saw you. Please don't scold Jojo. He didn't do it on purpose." and then she promptly fell asleep. When Anne was about 10 years old, she began to make plans to be a nun. When she heard her little sister also desired to be a nun, she was very excited and began to explain all the things that nuns do, some true and some not totally accurate. "We must practice the sort of things we shall have to do when we enter the convent," she told her little sister. Later, they were found in the dairy room, leaning over cheese and inhaling deeply. When asked what they were doing, they said they were mortifying themselves by smelling the cheese, because it doesn't smell very nice. However, despite her desire to become a nun, Anne had the feeling that she would die soon. Though she never spoke of death, she did speak much of heaven, so much that one of her friends, who also planned to become a nun, became worried, even though Anne was in good health at the time. So convinced that she would die soon, Anne asked her friend to take her place at the convent. A little confused and disturbed at Anne's insistence, her friend agreed. Around December 1921, Anne began to have headaches. She had had them in the past, and at first no one was very worried about them, since as usual, Anne didn't complain. For her, it was just another opportunity to sacrifice for sinners. For she said to her mother one day, "We have lots of joys here on earth, but they do not last. The only joy that lasts is to have made a sacrifice." Soon, when the pain only got worse and Anne was no longer able to eat or hide her pain, the doctor was called. Anne had meningitis. The pain was immense, and at first, Anne thrashed her head back and forth in pain. But when she saw how her pain scared her siblings, she waited until they were out of the room because she realized how it hurt them to see her suffer. Anne received communion much to her joy and extreme unction as well. By New Year's Day, she seemed to have taken a turn for the better. She had more energy and some of the brightness she used to have. She asked to see all the workers and maids of the house to give them a kiss and wish them a Happy New Year's. But 2 days later, her lungs had become paralyzed and Anne began suffocating. She bore this with remarkable patience, so when someone once commented how brave she bore her sufferings, she responded, "Oh no, I am only learning to suffer." In her last days, she asked the doctor how his other patients were doing, particularly patients who were children. The doctor, who was moved by Anne's unselfishness, said, "They're not as good as you are, that's how they're doing." Anne simply said, "Well, I expect they are more ill than I am, or perhaps they haven't got such a kind mother." The days dragged on and Anne got worse, but during this time she worried more about others than she did herself. Whenever she woke up during the night and saw someone sitting up with her, she would fret over them losing their sleep. Another time, when a nursing nun came to take over so her mother could rest, Anne said, "Why, sister, I really don't want you to stay beside me. You will get so tired." As an afterthought, she added, "You must be hungry too." 2 days before her death, it seemed that Anne's trial had ended. Her mother had left the room momentarily to make room for a visitor who wanted to see Anne. The visitor came out with tears in her eyes, saying, "I do thank God for having allowed me to see that child. She is indeed a saint. Her face looks simply angelic." Her mother was surprised to hear this, as Anne had been pale and drawn right before she had left the room. But, her mother writes, "I quickly went back in the room and found Anne completely changed. Her face was indeed lovely. She lay there, sweetly smiling." Anne began to see heavenly things, although no one knew exactly what she saw. The same day the pain passed, she suddenly became very animated and said, "Jojo, Leilaine, baby, come see. Oh, look how beautiful it is." The next day she told her mother she could see her guardian angel, telling her he was standing behind her. "There, mother, behind you. Turn around and you will see him." That night, she became much weaker, saying the act of hope over and over. On the morning of January 14th, she turned to her nurse and said, "Sister, may I go to the angels?" The nun nodded her head, and Anne said with a soft sigh, "Oh, thank you, thank you." The doctor, seeing her mother's grief, told Anne, "Look once more at your mother, dear." Anne made one more act of heroic obedience and looked at her mother tenderly, and then closed her eyes and died. She was 11 years old. Word spread, and people came to see the little body. Everyone agreed that she was a saint. Her brother Jojo, her little tormentor and friend, was sitting beside her body, refusing to leave, when suddenly, hit with inspiration, he began collecting everybody's rosaries, prayer books, and holy cards, and began to touch them to Anne's body. His mother watched on, not knowing what to say, as Jojo's actions were very boldly declaring Anne to be a saint. He looked at her and said, "One day you will be very glad I have done this," and he went on making relics. Not long after Anne's death, people began to pray to her, and miracles began pouring in. There were conversions of the most hardened sinners and those with no faith, and healings of those who were dying. Even her little sister, Marionette, who was very sick with a raging fever in 1925, suddenly got better after her mother put a scrap of Anne's clothing under her pillow. In 1932, Anne's cause for canonization was opened, and in 1933, her body was exhumed as part of the canonization process. It was found to be completely intact with her features exactly as it was the day she died. Anne de Gainey was declared venerable on March 3, 1990, by Saint Pope John Paul II. He declared her the Apostle of the Nursery. Dear Mother, you believe you are going to find an interesting story, but I don't want you to be deceived. The story you are going to read is not the story of my life, but the intimate life of a poor soul who, without any merit on her part, Jesus Christ loved in a special way and filled abundantly with his favors and graces. Juanita was born on July 13, 1900, in Santiago, Chile. She was the fourth of 6 children, although one had died just hours after she was born. Juanita was born in affluence, as she says in her diary. Jesus did not desire me to be born poor like himself. I was born in the midst of riches, spoiled by all. Her family was a wealthy farming family with a big rambling house, many horses, and lots of land. Teresa was born baptized Juanita after a family argument on what to name her. Her father wanted her to be named after his mother, Henrietta, and her mother wanted Juanita to be named after her own mother, Juana. And so, Juanita was given the names of both grandmothers, Juana Henrietta. And just to complicate things a little bit further, they threw in the name Josephine because her mother had a special devotion to Saint Joseph, and then both parents agreed to add the title of the Sacred Hearts because they had a devotion to the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary. So she was baptized Juana Henrietta Josephine of the Sacred Hearts, but they shortened it just to Juanita. Juanita was naturally good and cheerful. She was also very pretty and was told so secretly by all the family members, except for her mother, who didn't want Juanita's head getting too big with vanity. Later on in life, Juanita did struggle a little over vanity, but she tried very hard to work on it by practicing humility. She wrote of it later, "From the time I was small, they used to tell me I was the prettiest of my sisters, but I paid no attention to this. But they kept repeating these same words to me as I grew older, unbeknown to my mother, since she didn't like this. God alone knows what it cost me to overcome this pride and vanity that took possession of my heart as I grew older." She also struggled very much with her temper. As she says in her diary, she was the family's favorite, so she was spoiled and used to getting her own way. At 15 years old, Juanita began to keep a diary for her spiritual director, Mother Rios. Like Saint Therese of Lisieux, she wrote the story of her life. Without this diary, we would never know the spiritual heights that she had attained. The 1906 earthquake made a big impression on Juanita, even though she was only 6 years old at the time. As she said, "After the earthquake is when Jesus began to take my heart to be his own." She began to desire to make her Holy Communion, but was told that she was too young. During this time, she was to suffer very much, which would mature her soul. She says, "While I waited to make my first Holy Communion, The Virgin Mary helped me to cleanse my soul of every imperfection. Her suffering started with simply being told that she had to wait to receive communion. She asked every day and was always told no. As she was growing and maturing, she began to recognize her weaknesses and faults, and so she worked very hard on herself, although this wasn't easy. She had a temper, which she often describes as making my blood boil. When referring to school, which she hated because she preferred to be home, she would call it a jail or a dungeon, and said that it should be burned to the ground. Other times she would rebel by simply taking her time to obey when told to do something. It was costly for me to obey, especially when I was ordered to do something, and then out of negligence, I took my time in doing it. Her grandfather, whom she loved very much, died when she was 7 years old. Juanita was very close to her grandfather, and it was another reminder to her how short life is. She writes, "Every evening, grandfather made us mount a horse, flipping a coin to see who would be first. Rebecca always won. He was in good health until one night he was stricken with an attack of paralysis. May 13th, the day of his death, he received the sacraments. He called all his children and counseled them. By the side of his room there was an oratory. They began to say Mass when they saw his face filled with great fear, and he kept saying, 'Take him away,' while he covered his face with his hands. There were terrible temptations from the devil. My mother threw holy water on him, and the devil left. He suffered more spiritual attacks. And then, Juanita tells us that at the consecration of the Mass, when the sacred host was elevated, he died. His death made a lasting impression to young Juanita, who said, 'His death was that of a saint, as was his life.'" This was the beginning of Juanita's mystical experiences as her grandfather began to appear to her after his death. She writes, "I used to see my grandfather appear at the foot of the bed, but I didn't see more than half of his body. He appeared to me for 8 days. I was scared to death and went to Rebecca's bed. From that time on, I no longer saw him." At 10 years old, Juanita was finally allowed to receive communion, and for the whole month of June, the month of the Sacred Heart, she writes, "I modified my character completely. I did this to such an extent that my mother was very happy to see me preparing myself so well for my first communion." After receiving communion, which Juanita describes as a cloudless day, she said that she heard the voice of Jesus speak to her soul for the first time. It would become something almost ordinary for Juanita to hear the voice of Jesus, who counseled her on how to pray and how to become holy. In fact, it was so ordinary to her that she was surprised to find out that not everyone heard the voice of Jesus during communion. Shortly after her first communion, Juanita thought of heaven only and began to desire to go there. She writes, "I told the Virgin everything. From that day on, the earth no longer held attraction for me. I wanted to die and begged Jesus that he take me on the 8th of December, the feast of the Immaculate Conception." Jesus heard her prayer, and although he didn't allow her to die, he did allow her to get sick and suffer. She writes, "Every year I used to become sick on the 8th of December, so much that I believed I was going to die. When I was 12, I came down with diphtheria. I was near death, and my mother believed that I was dying because an aunt died of the same illness when she was 12 years old, and I was worse than she was. When she was 13, she had a terrible fever on the 8th of December. Again, she thought she would die, but recovered. On the following year, 1914 of December 8th, she had appendicitis. During this illness, Juanita suffered very much and received much counsel from our Lord. She said that as she lay sick in bed, she began to feel troubled about something. She brought this to Our Lady, who gave her bad advice. Juanita was confused and said, 'This is not the voice of my mother, because she can't be telling me this.' I called her and she said that the devil had answered me. I became fearful. Then she told me that whenever I heard the voice, I should ask, 'Are you my mother?' And this is what I always do." Another time, as she was lying in bed with the same illness, Jesus spoke to her. She had been upset and lonely because her older sister was sick, and everyone left Juanita alone to attend to her. She heard the voice of Jesus say, "What? I, Juanita, am alone on the altar for love of you, and you can't even suffer for a moment?" She says, "From that time the dear Jesus spoke to me. I spent entire hours conversing with him. That's the reason I enjoyed being alone. He went on teaching me how I should suffer and not complain, and about intimate union with himself. Then he told me he wanted me for himself and that he would like me to become a Carmelite. And so Juanita did not die. She had an operation for her appendicitis, but suffered from the effects of the anesthesia that was used, which caused her nervous system to go haywire. As stated before, Juanita didn't like school at all because she preferred to be with her family, and this school was a boarding school. Despite this, she was a very good student and was ahead of her class in all subjects. She wanted to attain high grades to make her parents happy. School is where Juanita really grew in holiness. She learned to serve others and to be a mentor to some of the younger students. She still struggled occasionally with her temper, as some of the young girls sometimes wouldn't listen when she needed them to. She writes of the incident in her diary. The other day, the little girls were misbehaving at table, and I became very impatient. Since I let them go on talking, I was told that I should have been stricter with them. I said they didn't want to listen to me. I became very angry, and when I saw the children, I told them that they were disagreeable. Would Jesus have acted in that way? Of course not. He would have scolded them and would not have excused them, but he wouldn't have insulted them as I did. It's true that it took me a long time to get control of myself, but afterwards I spoke of my anger, and the next day, to humble myself, I begged forgiveness from the children. These falls serve to make me aware that I'm still very imperfect. In confession, she wrote down what the priest counseled regarding impatience. I went to confession yesterday. The priest told me that 3 things are necessary to avoid impatience. Number 1, never manifest my anger outwardly. Number 2, be lovable with the person who causes my anger. And number 3, to be silent, to put down anger. She wanted to perform strict penances, but her confessor instead advised her to do lighter penances, such as praying with her arms out in the form of a cross or avoiding sweets. Later, he permitted her to wear a hair shirt. When Juanita graduated from high school, she desired to enter the Carmelite convent. However, like Saint Therese, she faced obstacles. Her father, who had lost the family fortune due to poor handling of finances, was now gone most of the time on business trips, which caused Juanita a lot of sadness as she missed him very much. She had to ask him through letters for his permission to enter Carmel and for money for a dowry. Although he did eventually grant permission, which made Juanita very happy, the rest of her family was not. Her older brother, Luis, was very angry that she was leaving the family to be a nun. He felt that she had far too many gifts and beauty to be wasted behind the walls of a cloister. In fact, the day before she was about to enter, he wrote her a long letter, trying hard to talk her out of going. As this would have grieved most, Juanita understood her brother and responded with love. At one time, she and her brother were very close. It was he who taught her to have devotion to the Blessed Virgin, and he that she had made a pact with to say the rosary together every day. In fact, she only missed one day when she forgot. As her brother entered his teen years, he began to have doubts about his faith and began to live a life of drinking and partying, which grieved her mother so much that she begged God to take him rather than live a life of sin. It was to this brother that Juanita gave her beloved statue of the Blessed Virgin, she who had earned it years before during one of her sicknesses by taking her medicine in trade for the statue. She had already had a meeting with the mother prioress, and all agreed that she would be most welcome. Before entering Carmel, she had her photograph taken in the Carmelite habit. This was the custom in those days, since no photography equipment was allowed in the convent. Here she is clothed in a black veil of a fully professed sister. However, Juanita only received the white veil of a postulant since she didn't live long enough. On May 7, 1919, Juanita entered the convent on the feast of her patron, St. Joseph. Juanita was like a newlywed on her honeymoon. She knew nothing but happiness. She writes, "It's been 8 days since I have been in Carmel, 8 days of heaven. I feel the divine love to be so great that there are moments when I feel I'm unable to resist." When she received the habit, she was formally given the name Sister Teresa of Jesus. Those early days were nothing but happiness, and the sisters that knew her say that she would often go into giggling fits. One time, things got so out of hand that the priest who was visiting was unable to say grace after meals, much to his annoyance. For 11 months, St. Teresa only knew happiness. She spoke of her happiness often, telling a friend in a letter that she was the happiest creature on earth. On Holy Week of 1920, Sister Teresa absorbed herself in prayer and contemplation of the suffering of Jesus. Yet, on Holy Thursday, St. Teresa fell ill. She didn't say anything to anyone about it and spent long hours on her knees. The Mother Prioress noticed Sister Teresa's pale face and fever-flushed cheeks, and immediately called the doctor and sent her to bed. It was determined she had typhus, and as she had been sick for weeks, it had progressed into advanced stages. They contacted Sister Teresa's family, and her mother immediately sent over the family physician to oversee her care. Sister Teresa was in and out of delirium from her high fever. She also suffered extreme spiritual darkness. When she was 17 years old, she offered herself for any death the Lord wanted to give her, even the death of abandonment, and it appears that the Lord accepted her offering. When she wasn't delirious, Mother Angelica, fearing the end was near, suggested that Sister Teresa make her religious vows in the Carmelite order. In those days, this was allowed under special circumstances. Sister Teresa made her profession shortly after midnight, and she prayerfully repeated the formula 3 more times with great emotion. Later, she received the Holy Viaticum. On April 12, 1920, Sister Teresa died. She was 19 years and 9 months old. Her family came to view the body one last time. They were all heartbroken, of course. Her sister Rebecca would end up joining the same cloister a few months later. The funeral overwhelmed and surprised everyone as large crowds came to pay their respects. This was very surprising as Sister Teresa was a cloistered nun and no one from the Los Andes area even knew about her, and nothing had been done to publicize the services. Even more surprising was how many priests came. This affected especially her brother Luis, who still struggled with his doubts. However, the magnitude of how many people came amazed and moved him. He watched in awe that instead of going home after the funeral mass, people stayed to touch the rosaries and medals against Sister Teresa's body. Somehow, everyone knew that she was a saint. Later, he would say that his sister's life and death were his greatest moral miracle. After the 2 required miracles for her canonization were approved, Pope John Paul II canonized her as Saint Teresa of the Andes on Columbus Day, 1992.